All right, in this video, we'll begin the first of 3 videos concerning the brain. And just as a note, before we get into these videos, I think it's important to note that this is just the surface. For everything I'll mention, there are 4 things that I didn't mention. And so I encourage you to go and study and learn those things on your own, but just know that there is a certain depth that you're being required to learn. The rest of that is for your own enrichment as you see fit. So just kind of stick to the beaten path as far as what I'm saying. There may be things on the pictures that you see that are going to be in addition to. So just remember what I say is what you're going to be tested on, not necessarily all the other things that you see. All right. So a little bit about brain development from an embryological standpoint. Basically, as an embryo, your nerves or your spinal cord and brain form from the nerve that runs along the dorsal side of the body. It's called the neural tube. And this neural tube, and you see it on the left there, basically begins to enlarge toward the anterior end, which the anterior end is toward the head. So that makes sense, right? And eventually begins to kind of constrict into these 3 main vesicles here. The prosencephalon, which is the forebrain. This is going to become what we're going to call the cerebrum. The mesencephalon, which becomes the midbrain and stays pretty much that midbrain. And then the rhombencephalon, this becomes the cerebellum and parts of the brainstem. Now you'll notice there are several other parts here. We will actually talk about the diencephalon, but we're not going to mention these other things. So I mainly want you to talk or concern yourself with these 3 embryological developmental stages. And this gives you a picture of what that kind of looks like. You have the anterior end that becomes the brain, the posterior end becomes the spinal cord, and so this is at week 5, and the next one's week 13. You'll notice a distinct difference. It almost looks like a little whale or something with a mouth and an eye. I don't know. It's weird. But so this is your brain, what you would think of as your brain, right? Your cerebral hemispheres. And then the brain stem, cerebellum, which is the base of the brain. And so this is at week 13. You can see this was just a nerve kind of crinkled up. And so it kind of becomes the brain. And so as you develop as an embryo, this anterior end of this nerve cord is just going to get bigger, becomes a lot more and more specialized. And the brain in development actually grows faster than the surrounding skull. And so in order to fit, it has to like fold up, which is what you see here. And so this is a standard trick the body uses throughout your development to create surface area to volume ratio. It's more surface area, more work, and less volume to take up. And so many places in the body work this way, and the brain is no exception to that. That's what all those wrinkles mean, basically, is that the brain is cramming more brain into a smaller space. All right, so there are 4 regions to the adult brain. There are the cerebral hemispheres. When you think of brain, this is probably what you're thinking of. There is the diencephalon, which you can see there's the purple tiny brain inside the big brain. The brain stem, which is the green area there. And then the cerebellum, which is like at the base of the back of your head. Think of it that way. There are 2 divisions, I guess, of the nervous tissue in the brain and spinal cord. They're called gray and white matter. And the gray matter is short, non-myelated neurons. And so, okay, what do we mean by these words? Short, you get that one. Non-myelated, so it does not have the myelin sheath on it. And so these are shorter neurons. Some of them are just cell bodies. And then the white matter, which is on the inside, these are myelated neurons, and there are some non-myelated axons that are in there as well. You can kind of see that. Actually, all of what I just said is shortened version right there. All right. In the brain, there are these chambers known as ventricles, and these ventricles are just fluid-filled chambers. And the brain has this fluid in it called cerebrospinal fluid, which I don't see on here anywhere. We'll see it in another picture probably soon. Cerebrospinal fluid, and this fluid is important for keeping the brain healthy. And so these ventricles basically serve as a way for this to go throughout the brain and surrounding areas. All right, so a little bit about the cerebral hemispheres. These are the superior part of the brain. Not that they're the best, but that they're literally the top and most forward part of the brain. And they account for about 80% or 83% of the brain mass. And they are marked by lots of different ridges and such. Let's see. Nope, I don't have a picture with those things on it. All right, so they are called the gyri, Gyre, and these are the ridges that you see. These ridges. All right. They're the sulci, Sulci. These are these shallow little grooves. So gyri and sulci. And then you have these fissures, which I think you understand what a fissure is. These are these deep grooves that you can see throughout here that typically mark the different portions of the brain. You can kind of see here some of those deeper grooves. All right. There's a longitudinal fissure, which you see here, and this separates the left from the right, and there's actually labeled there for us. Longitudinal fissure separates the left from the right, and it's joined by this area in the middle called the corpus callosum, which I'll probably have on another slide. The corpus callosum joins the two areas in the middle. And there is the transverse cerebral fissure. It separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum, which is right here. And you have these different sulci and fissures that divide the lobes. And the lobes of the brain that you need to know are called the frontal lobe, which is the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, which corresponds to the parietal bone of the head, that's kind of the top and side, the occipital lobe, which is the back, and then the temporal lobe of the brain. And there's another lobe you need to be familiar with, and it is called the insula. And we will see that one on another picture where the insula is like right inside here. All right. And it is a fifth lobe of the brain that you need to be familiar with. And so a little bit about what you see here. This is called the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is like the executive suite of the brain. All right. It is where all the business is happening. This is the site of the conscious mind. So things like just actually being aware of your person, being aware of the fact that you're aware is happening here. Sensory perception, voluntary motor function, communication, memory, understanding, all of this is happening in the cerebral cortex. Four general considerations, or three general considerations for the cerebral cortex. You have the motor areas, which you can see located there. We'll talk about all these individually. The sensory areas, and then the association areas, which will be the most abstract of that. And we'll talk about that. All right. So motor areas, this makes sense. This is mostly found in the frontal lobe, and this has to do with voluntary movement. I choose to pick up a pencil. That is happening in the motor areas. The sensory areas, these are located in different places around the brain, the parietal, the temporal, insular, and occipital lobes. And this is exactly what it says it is. It takes in sensory input from from your environment. And then the association areas. All right, you have a couple of these association areas. And association is a little bit abstract, but we all understand it, right? I hear a noise, like I hear a loud noise outside. It's a loud rumbling noise right now. I know by this time that there's a big truck pulling out there to pick something up, like maybe pick up the trash or something like that. All right. I've made an association. I didn't just receive that sensory input, which I did, but I also associated it with something I already knew. And so this is this is what separates us from a lot of the animal kingdom, is we make these kinds of associations. All right, we're receiving input from it receives input from those sensory areas. It integrates that information. This allows us to give meaning to the information that we receive, allows us to store memory, tie things to previous experiences. I think you get the idea. All right, this makes us who we are as these association areas. And then lastly, there is this concept of lateralization of the brain. And this is the division of labor between the two hemispheres of the brain. So you have your left and right brain. These are all things that we've heard before. The two hemispheres of the brain are not identical. The left brain is doing things the right brain isn't necessarily doing. All right. Most people are right brain or left brain dominant. All right. And so this shows out by the fact that most people are right-handed, because the left brain typically controls the right side of the body. Not all. Some of us are left-handed. And so in some of us, about 10% of us, that those roles are reversed. All right. And so if you're dominant on one side, all your language and that kind of stuff is going to come from that area. But typically, people who are left brain dominant tend to be stronger at using language, math, logic, whereas people who are more right brain dominant are better at emotion, intuition, artistic, musical. These things are not 100% proven. They're kind of, a lot of speculatory evidence, but they are pretty neat to think about. So don't think, well, I'm left-handed, so I must be bad at math. That's not the case. All right. You can be left-handed and a logical person. It's just typically those two things aren't associated with one another because of just trends in understanding how the brain works.